The village of Oakhaven nestled in a valley where the late afternoon sun bled across the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. A sense of unease hung heavy in the air, thicker than the humid stillness that often preceded a storm. Even the usually boisterous sounds of children playing were absent, replaced by a hushed quiet that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the community. At the western edge of the village, smoke curled lazily from the chimney of a modest, time-worn farmhouse, the home of Silas Blackwood, a man who had seen 80 summers turn to autumn in Oakhaven. Now, Silas lay still and silent within, his long life having finally drawn to a close. Inside the dimly lit room, a small gathering of family stood vigil. Eleanor, Silas's eldest daughter, a woman whose quiet strength had always been the bedrock of the family, stood near the bedside, her face etched with sorrow. Her husband, Thomas, a man of gentle disposition and few words, stood beside her, his hand resting comfortingly on her shoulder. Their son, young Arthur, barely a teenager, stood slightly apart, his youthful face a mask of confusion and budding grief. But the stillness of mourning was a fragile thing, soon to be shattered. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and a figure stumbled into the room, reeking of cheap ale and defiance. This was Finn, Silas's youngest child, a man nearing 40 whose life had been a tapestry of broken promises and fleeting ambitions, each failure often drowned in the bottom of a tankard. His eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, swept across the room, landing with a sneer on the still form of his father. "Well, look at him," Finn slurred, his voice cutting through the somber atmosphere like a jagged shard of glass. "Finally kicked the bucket, has he? About time." Eleanor's breath hitched, and Thomas's hand tightened on her shoulder. Arthur's eyes widened in shock and hurt. The other villagers who had come to pay their respects exchanged uneasy glances. Finn's disrespect for his father, even in death, was a familiar, yet still jarring, occurrence. "Finn, please," Eleanor pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. "Show some respect. This is not the time." Finn let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Respect? For what? For a life spent, what? Toiling in the fields? Leaving me with nothing but this miserable shack and a pile of debts?" He gestured wildly around the room, his movements unsteady. "He never understood me. Never." The tension in the room thickened palpably. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Some of the older villagers shook their heads, their faces grim. Silas had been a respected man in Oakhaven, and Finn's callous outburst was seen as a deep affront, not just to his memory, but to the very fabric of their community. Thomas stepped forward, his usually placid face now firm. "Finn, you've had too much to drink. Perhaps you should go outside and get some air." "And miss all the fun?" Finn retorted, his gaze locking onto Thomas with a flicker of resentment. "The grand farewell to the old man? No, I think I'll stay. Make sure you're not trying to swindle me out of my inheritance." He spat the last word out as if it were a bitter taste in his mouth. Eleanor's control finally snapped. Tears welled in her eyes, and a sob escaped her lips. "How can you be like this, Finn? Our father is gone. Can't you feel anything?" Finn simply shrugged, his face hardening. "Sentimental nonsense. He's gone. The world keeps turning." He lurched further into the room, his presence a dark cloud over the already sorrowful scene. The air crackled with unspoken accusations and long-simmering resentments. The simple act of mourning had been poisoned by the bitter conflict that had long plagued the Blackwood family, a conflict that now cast a long, ominous shadow over the quiet passing of their patriarch. The weight of their shared history, the unspoken hurts and the raw grief, hung heavy in the air, a suffocating prelude to the strange and terrifying events that were about to unfold. The peace that death should have brought to the Blackwood household was already shattered, leaving a void ripe for something far more sinister to take root. And as the storm clouds gathered outside, mirroring the tempest within, a sense of foreboding settled over Oakhaven, a silent whisper of the darkness yet to come. The somber procession wound its way through the village the following afternoon, the heavy oak coffin borne on the shoulders of Silas's lifelong friends and neighbors. A light drizzle began to fall, the droplets clinging to the black fabric of mourning clothes like tears. Eleanor walked behind the coffin, her face pale and drawn, supported by Thomas. Young Arthur trailed behind, his eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the polished wood of his grandfather's final resting place. Finn, surprisingly subdued, walked a few paces behind, his usual swagger replaced by a sullen silence. As they reached the ancient stone cemetery at the edge of Oakhaven, the rain intensified, turning into a steady downpour. The mourners huddled under umbrellas, the wind whipping their garments around them. The village priest, Father Michael, his voice solemn, began the final rites. Just as the coffin was being lowered into the earth, a sudden, sharp crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. In the ensuing chaos, a small, jet-black cat, its fur sleek with rain, darted through the crowd. It leaped onto the edge of the open grave, its emerald eyes glowing unnaturally in the dim light, and then, in a swift, fluid motion, it jumped directly onto the coffin as it rested at the bottom of the pit before disappearing into the darkness beneath. A collective gasp rippled through the mourners. Superstitions ran deep in Oakhaven, and a black cat crossing a grave, especially during a storm, was considered a potent omen of bad luck, even death itself. Whispers of unease spread through the crowd, their sorrow momentarily overshadowed by a prickle of fear. Father Michael paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He cleared his throat and continued the service, but the air had shifted, the solemnity now tinged with a palpable sense of foreboding. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, the image of the black cat burned into their minds. Later that evening, after the last mourners had departed and the rain had subsided to a gentle patter, a lone figure stood at the edge of the Blackwood family plot. It was Old Man Hemlock, the village elder, a man whose weathered face held the wisdom and the worries of generations. He stared at the freshly turned earth, his brow furrowed in thought. He had seen strange things in his long life, and the incident with the black cat had stirred a deep unease within him, a feeling that this was not the end of Silas Blackwood's story, but perhaps the beginning of something far more troubling for Oakhaven. The old ways, the old beliefs, still held sway in this quiet corner of the world, and Hemlock felt a cold dread gripped his heart, a premonition of darkness descending upon their peaceful village. The earth had taken Silas, but something else, something unseen and malevolent, might have been invited in that storm-swept afternoon. The days that followed were heavy with a strange stillness. The Blackwood house remained shrouded in a quiet grief, but beneath the surface, a subtle shift began to occur. Food left on the kitchen table seemed to spoil at an unnatural rate, turning rancid overnight. Doors that had been securely latched would swing open on their own with no discernible breeze. A creeping coldness seemed to permeate the house, clinging to the shadows even on the warmest afternoons. Outside, a disquieting pattern emerged among the animals. Hens were found dead in their coops, their necks twisted at impossible angles, but with no signs of predators. The Blackwood's old hound, usually a placid and loyal companion, began to growl and snap at empty corners of rooms, its fur bristling as if facing an unseen threat. Even the usually fearless farm cats seemed skittish, their backs arched and their eyes wide with an unidentifiable fear. Finn, still staying in the house, initially dismissed these occurrences as mere coincidence, the house settling, bad luck with the food. But even his cynical nature began to waver as the incidents grew more frequent and more unsettling. He started to drink more heavily, seeking oblivion from the growing unease that even he could not entirely ignore. One evening, Eleanor was preparing supper when a heavy wooden chopping board, left leaning against the wall, suddenly clattered to the floor. She jumped, her heart pounding, and looked around the empty kitchen. There was no draft, no tremor. Just a silence that felt thick and expectant. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a cold premonition that this house, their home, was no longer quite as it should be. That same night, young Arthur awoke to a strange scratching sound coming from the hallway outside his room. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained his ears, but the sound had stopped. He dismissed it as the wind or an animal outside, but a lingering feeling of unease kept him awake long after the silence returned. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness, something cold and hungry. The familiar comfort of his room had been replaced by a subtle, creeping dread, a sense that the veil between their world and something else was thinning, and that something was beginning to seep through. The once comforting sounds of their old house were now imbued with a sense of menace, each creak and groan seeming to carry a hidden, sinister meaning. The peace of their morning was being steadily eroded by an unseen force, leaving behind a gnawing fear that whispered of something unnatural at play within the very walls of their home. The unsettling atmosphere in the Blackwood house seeped into the wider village of Oakhaven. Neighbors, noticing the strange occurrences and the increasingly erratic behavior of the Blackwood's animals, began to whisper amongst themselves. Old Man Hemlock, his unease growing, shared his concerns with Father Michael. The priest, a man of faith but also of the community, listened intently, his own brow furrowed with worry. He had heard tales of such things before, old wives' stories dismissed as folklore, but the growing sense of disquiet in Oakhaven felt different, more tangible. One particularly still afternoon, Martha, a kind-hearted neighbor who often brought food to Eleanor, returned from the Blackwood house looking pale and shaken. She recounted how she had placed a bowl of stew on the kitchen table only to find it crawling with maggots less than an hour later. The stew had been freshly made, the ingredients wholesome. There was no logical explanation. The story spread through the village like wildfire, fueling the growing unease. Fear began to mingle with their sympathy for the grieving Blackwood family. People started to avoid the house after dusk, their steps quickening as they passed by. The once comforting familiarity of their close-knit community was being eroded by a shared, unspoken dread. Even Sheriff Brody, a pragmatic man who usually scoffed at superstitious talk, found himself troubled by the reports. He couldn't explain the dead animals with no visible wounds or the stories of food spoiling inexplicably. He paid a visit to the Blackwood house, his presence a mixture of official duty and personal concern for Eleanor. He found her pale and exhausted, her eyes shadowed with a fear that seemed to go beyond simple grief. Finn was nowhere to be seen, having taken to spending most of his days at the local tavern, seeking solace in the bottom of a bottle. Eleanor spoke of the strange occurrences in hushed tones, her voice barely above a whisper. Sheriff Brody listened patiently, trying to find a rational explanation, but even he had to admit that her account was deeply unsettling. He promised to keep an eye on things, but he left the house with a gnawing feeling that this was something beyond his jurisdiction, something that a badge and a gun could not solve. The peace of Oakhaven was being threatened by a darkness that seemed to defy logic, a shadow that was slowly creeping from the Blackwood house and into the heart of their quiet village. The familiar comfort of their community was being replaced by a growing sense of dread, a shared fear of the unknown that hung heavy in the air, a silent testament to the unsettling events unfolding within the Blackwood home. The whispers grew louder, the shadow seemed to lengthen, and the once peaceful village of Oakhaven held its breath, waiting for the inevitable breaking point. The unease within the Blackwood house reached a terrifying crescendo one cold, moonless night. Eleanor, unable to sleep, had gone downstairs to fetch a glass of water. As she passed Finn's closed bedroom door, she heard a series of muffled thuds followed by a low, guttural moan. Fear clenched her heart. Finn's drinking had been getting worse, and she worried he had fallen and hurt himself. She knocked hesitantly. "Finn? Are you all right?" There was no response, only silence. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A growing sense of dread washed over her. She tried the handle. It was locked from the inside. Panic began to set in. She ran to Arthur's room and woke him, her voice frantic. Together, they tried to force the door open, but it held firm. Thomas, roused by the commotion, joined them, and with a combined effort, they finally managed to splinter the lock and push the door inward. The scene that greeted them sent a wave of pure, unadulterated horror through them. Finn lay sprawled on the floor, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, filled with a terror that had clearly been his last emotion. His skin was cold and clammy, and a faint, sickly sweet odor hung in the air. But it was what lay beside him that truly chilled them to the bone. Silas's coffin, which had been stored in Finn's room after the burial, now lay open. And inside, curled up like a grotesque parody of sleep, was Finn's lifeless body. His skin was already beginning to show signs of decomposition, a stark and horrifying contrast to the relatively fresh state of his death. Eleanor screamed, a raw, primal sound of anguish and terror. Arthur stumbled backward, his face ashen, his young mind unable to comprehend the horror before him. Thomas stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning dread. Sheriff Brody arrived quickly after Eleanor's frantic call. Even his hardened demeanor cracked slightly at the sight. The scene in Finn's room defied any rational explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle. Just the inexplicably dead body of Finn inside his father's coffin. The news of Finn's gruesome death spread through Oakhaven like a plague. The whispers turned into open expressions of fear and dread. The incident with the black cat, the spoiling food, the dead animals, all the unsettling occurrences now coalesced into a terrifying picture. Something was wrong in Oakhaven, terribly wrong, and the Blackwood family seemed to be at the center of it. The peace of their village had been shattered, replaced by a gnawing fear of the unknown, a chilling premonition of further darkness to come. The rational world seemed to have tilted on its axis, and the good people of Oakhaven were left to grapple with a horror that defied explanation, a nightmare that had taken root in their quiet community. Dem moa kin hong ba su tro like kd okay, I've expanded the story focusing on the requested details and maintaining the tone and style. Here's the expanded content. The discovery of Finn's lifeless form nestled within his father's coffin sent shockwaves through the already fractured peace of Oakhaven. The inexplicable nature of his death, the chilling image of him lying amongst the remnants of his father's passing, amplified the growing fear that had been subtly creeping through the village. It was no longer just whispers of bad luck or strange occurrences, this was a tangible horror, a stark and brutal intrusion of the unnatural into their ordinary lives. The day Silas Blackwood was laid to rest had begun with a fragile semblance of peace, a quiet sorrow that befit the passing of an elder. The afternoon sunset, a bright red color, cast long shadows over Oakhaven, painting the scene with an unsettling hue. It was a sunset that seemed to bleed across the sky, a fiery omen hanging over the somber gathering. But as the last prayers were uttered and the first clods of earth struck the coffin, the heavens opened with a sudden, torrential downpour. The rain lashed down with an almost vengeful intensity, turning the cemetery into a muddy quagmire. Mourners huddled together, their black umbrellas offering little protection against the deluge. It was during this chaotic descent into darkness that the black cat appeared. Sleek and silent, it materialized as if from nowhere, its eyes twin embers of green fire in the gloom. It moved with an unnerving grace, a shadow against the deepening gray, and then, with a swift, unsettling leap, it bounded across the open grave, landing squarely on Silas's coffin just as it reached its final resting place. A collective gasp escaped the lips of the assembled villagers. In the old ways of Oakhaven, such an event was more than just a random occurrence, it was a dire omen, a black mark against the already somber occasion. Whispers of ill fortune and impending doom rippled through the crowd, their grief momentarily eclipsed by a primal fear. The sight of the black cat leaping over the coffin, its form a stark silhouette against the storm-ravaged sky, was a chilling tableau. Some recalled ancient tales of Catsith, fairy creatures said to steal the souls of the recently deceased, while others whispered of witches and their familiars, their dark magic unleashed upon the village. Black cats have long been associated with bad omens, particularly in Western cultures, where they are often linked to witchcraft and misfortune. The cat's sudden appearance and its bold act were seen as a blatant disrespect to the dead, a sign that the very fabric of their reality was being torn asunder. Adding to the growing disquiet was the presence of a traveling monk who had arrived in Oakhaven the day before the funeral. He was a gaunt figure with piercing eyes and an air of quiet solemnity. He had offered his services to perform additional rites, a gesture that Eleanor, in her grief, had gratefully accepted. Throughout the funeral service, the monk had chanted in a low, resonant voice, his words weaving through the sounds of weeping in the drumming rain. But when the black cat made its fateful leap, the monk's chanting faltered. His eyes, which had been fixed on the descending coffin, snapped towards the creature with an expression of stark alarm. It was as if he had witnessed something truly unholy, a violation of the sacred ground they stood upon. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, and his usually steady hands trembled slightly as he clutched his prayer beads. As the gravediggers began to fill the pit, the monk abruptly stopped his chanting. He gathered his few belongings with an almost frantic haste, his movements sharp and uncharacteristic of his previous calm demeanor. He offered a curt, almost mumbled farewell to Eleanor and Thomas, his eyes darting nervously around the cemetery as if he sensed an unseen presence. Without another word, he turned and practically fled from the graveyard, his figure disappearing quickly down the muddy path leading back to the village. His long robes billowed behind him, catching on the wind like sails, as if the very storm was urging him to flee. His sudden and unexplained departure left a palpable sense of unease among the remaining mourners. They exchanged bewildered glances, wondering at the monk's strange behavior. Old man Hemlock, his face etched with concern, muttered to Father Michael, the village priest, about the incident with the cat and the monk's hasty retreat. Father Michael, a man of steady faith, tried to offer a rational explanation. Perhaps the monk had taken ill, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The elements themselves seemed to be in turmoil, and now, one who was meant to offer spiritual solace had fled as if pursued by demons. The priest's words were meant to calm, but they rang hollow in the face of the mounting dread. He couldn't ignore the knot of unease tightening in his own stomach, the feeling that they were all witnesses to something far beyond their comprehension. The night that followed was one of oppressive darkness and relentless rain. The storm raged with a fury that Oakhaven rarely witnessed, the wind howling like a banshee and the rain lashing against the windows like angry fists. Inside the Blackwood house, sleep offered little respite. Eleanor tossed and turned, haunted by the image of the black cat and the monk's terrified eyes. Thomas lay beside her, his own rest disturbed by a growing sense of unease. Young Arthur, huddled in his bed, imagined shadows dancing in the corners of his room, fueled by the hushed and worried tones of the adults. The storm seemed to mirror their inner turmoil, the chaotic elements reflecting the growing sense of dread that had taken root in their hearts. Then, sometime in the dead of night, a sound pierced through the storm's fury. It was a scraping, groaning sound, coming from downstairs. Eleanor and Thomas sat bolt upright in bed, their hearts pounding. They exchanged a look of fear and confusion. What could be making such a noise? The wind? The old house settling? But this sound was different, heavier, more deliberate. It was a sound that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth, a sound that spoke of disturbance and violation. Thomas cautiously rose and made his way downstairs, Eleanor close behind. The darkness was thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the hallway in stark, eerie bursts. The scraping sound grew louder as they approached the parlor, the room where Silas's coffin had rested before the funeral. Each step was a heavy thud against the silence, each flash of lightning a glimpse into the abyss of their fear. The air grew heavy, thick with a cold, musty scent that spoke of the grave. Thomas pushed the door open slowly, and a gasp escaped Eleanor's lips. In the flickering light of a candle that had somehow remained lit despite the storm, they saw it. Silas's coffin lay on the floor, the heavy oak-lid askew. And standing beside it, his back to them, was a figure that sent a chill deeper than the storm into their very souls. The scene was a tableau of horror, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist around the room. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, a palpable sense of wrongness that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. It was Silas. But this was not the Silas they had mourned, the gentle patriarch who had passed peacefully in his sleep. This Silas stood stiffly, his movements jerky and unnatural. His clothes, the ones he had been buried in, were damp and clinging to his gaunt frame. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his long, gray hair hung lank and wet around a face that was utterly devoid of life. His skin was pale and cold, his eyes wide open but unseeing, reflecting the candlelight with a disturbing lack of warmth. The Silas they knew was gone, replaced by this grotesque parody of life, a puppet animated by some unknown and malevolent force. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over them without recognition. There was no spark of the familiar warmth in those vacant eyes, only a cold, empty stare that seemed to pierce right through them. A low, guttural sound rumbled in his chest, a sound that was not Silas's voice, but something else. It was a sound that seemed to claw its way up from the depths of the earth, a sound that spoke of decay and the grave. Then, he spoke, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to claw its way from the depths of the grave. "My coffin." The words hung in the air, heavy with an unnatural chill. Eleanor and Thomas stood frozen, their minds reeling in disbelief and terror. This couldn't be real. Silas was dead. They had seen him laid to rest. But the figure before them, though bearing his likeness, was something else entirely, something cold and lifeless that had somehow clawed its way back from the earth. The familiar comfort of their home had been shattered, replaced by the impossible, the horrifying reality of Silas's return. But this was not a joyous reunion, this was something dark and unnatural, a violation of the natural order that sent a primal fear coursing through their veins. What had happened in that grave? What unholy force had dragged Silas back from the peace of death? And what did this thing want with his coffin? The question swirled in their minds, unanswered and terrifying, as they stood paralyzed by the horrifying spectacle before them, the storm outside a mere echo of the storm raging within their hearts. The night of Silas's burial had indeed become a night of horrifying return, a descent into a nightmare that Oakhaven would never forget. The following days were a blur of fear and confusion for the Blackwood family and the villagers of Oakhaven. The rain continued to fall, a constant reminder of the night Silas returned. Whispers turned into frantic discussions as people tried to make sense of the impossible. Some spoke of ancient curses, others of restless spirits, and a few even dared to suggest that Silas had been possessed by a demon. Superstitions surrounding death and funerals were rampant, and every unusual occurrence was interpreted as another sign of impending doom. Inside the Blackwood house, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Silas remained in his room, the coffin a constant presence. He refused to speak to anyone except to repeat his chilling demand, "My coffin." He moved with a strange, unsettling stiffness, his eyes still vacant and cold. Eleanor and Thomas watched him with a mixture of terror and grief, unsure if the man they loved was truly gone or if some twisted version of him remained. One afternoon, Eleanor, driven by a desperate need to understand, ventured into Silas's room. The air inside was cold, and a faint smell of earth and decay hung in the air. Silas lay on the bed, staring at the wall, his face pale and gaunt. The coffin stood beside the bed, a dark and ominous presence. "Silas," Eleanor said, her voice trembling, "what's happening to you? What do you want?" Silas turned his head slowly, his eyes fixing on her with that same unnerving emptiness. "My coffin," he rasped, his voice like the scraping of stone on stone. "But why, Silas? Why do you need it?" Eleanor pleaded, tears streaming down her face. He didn't answer, only stared at her with those lifeless eyes. Eleanor recoiled, a wave of fear washing over her. She realized then that whatever had returned in Silas's body was not her husband. It was something else, something cold and alien. Meanwhile, Thomas sought answers from Father Michael. The priest, though shaken, tried to offer comfort and guidance. He spoke of faith and the power of prayer, but even his words seemed to lack conviction in the face of such overwhelming darkness. "We must remain strong in our faith, Thomas," Father Michael said, his voice grave. "Whatever has taken Silas is a perversion of life, an affront to God's will. We must pray for his soul and for the protection of this village." But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that prayer alone wouldn't be enough. He felt a growing sense of helplessness, a fear that they were facing something beyond their understanding and beyond their ability to control. As the days turned into nights, the situation in Oakhaven grew increasingly desperate. People stayed indoors, afraid to venture out after dark. The village, once a place of peace and tranquility, was now shrouded in fear and suspicion. The red sunset painted the sky in streaks of blood, mirroring the village's grim mood. The dogs howled in the distance, their mournful cries adding to the unsettling atmosphere. One evening, a group of villagers, driven by fear and desperation, gathered outside the Blackwood house. They demanded that something be done, that Silas be contained or destroyed. Thomas, torn between his love for his father and his fear of what he had become, tried to reason with them. "He's still my father," Thomas pleaded. "We can't just—" "That's not your father," a villager shouted, his voice filled with fear. "That's a monster. It needs to be stopped." The crowd grew restless, their fear turning into anger. Thomas realized that he couldn't control them, that they were on the verge of taking matters into their own hands. Just as the situation threatened to erupt into violence, a figure emerged from the Blackwood house. It was Silas. He stood on the porch, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. He raised his hand, and a silence fell over the crowd. "You want my coffin?" he rasped, his voice echoing through the night. "Then you shall have it." With a swift, unnatural movement, Silas plunged his hand into his chest. The villagers gasped as he pulled out a dark, pulsating object. It was his heart, but it was not the heart of a living man. It was cold and black, and it pulsed with a malevolent energy. Silas held the heart aloft, and the wind seemed to pick up, swirling around him like a vortex. The sky darkened, and the rain began to fall again, heavier than before. The villagers watched in horror as Silas placed his heart back into his chest. His eyes burned with an unholy light, and a chilling smile spread across his face. "Now," he said, his voice filled with a dark triumph, "you will all join me in my coffin." The ground began to tremble, and the Blackwood house groaned and shifted. Cracks appeared in the walls, and the foundation began to crumble. The villagers screamed in terror as the house began to collapse around them, a monstrous coffin swallowing them whole. The night of Silas's return had become a night of horrifying reckoning, a night that would forever be etched in the nightmares of Oakhaven. The transcript provided adds another layer of complexity to the story. It introduces the character of Tam, a drunken and disrespectful son, whose behavior contrasts sharply with the somber events surrounding his father's death. Tam's outburst and the ensuing violence highlight the breakdown of social order in the face of grief and the supernatural. The monk's reaction is also given more weight in the transcript. He is not merely a passive observer but an active participant, attempting to ward off the evil with his sutras. His knowledge of the black cat's significance and his desperate attempt to contain the evil suggest a deeper understanding of the forces at play. The transcript also provides a more detailed account of the events following Silas's resurrection. His demand for his coffin is repeated, emphasizing its importance to whatever force now inhabits his body. The fear and confusion of the family are palpable, and the villagers' reaction is one of growing panic. The introduction of the 3 incense sticks omen adds another layer of supernatural dread. It suggests that the forces at play are not only malevolent but also bound by certain rules or patterns. The villagers' reliance on omens and superstitions highlights their vulnerability and their desperate attempt to make sense of the inexplicable. The story, now expanded, weaves together elements of folk horror, supernatural thriller, and family drama. It explores themes of grief, fear, and the breakdown of social order in the face of the unknown. The vivid descriptions and the escalating tension create a truly chilling and unforgettable narrative. Bong matroy de va noi kin hong lan ron. Following the chilling revelation of Silas's animated form and his unsettling demand for his coffin, a disquiet deeper than the grave settled upon the Blackwood household, a harbinger of the spectral horrors that were about to unfold. The unnatural chill that permeated the parlor, the very air thick with a silence that felt heavy and expectant, seemed to linger, seeping into the very walls and floorboards of the old house. It was more than just the lingering cold of a poorly heated room, it was a profound, bone-deep cold that spoke of the absence of life, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the impossible event they had witnessed. Silas, their patriarch, returned from the embrace of death, yet different. But the terror that had seized Eleanor and Thomas that night, a raw, primal fear that clawed at their sanity, was merely the opening act in a macabre play, the first tremor before the earthquake of the bazaar struck Oakhaven, shaking the very foundations of their reality. In the immediate aftermath of Silas's unsettling reanimation, a series of unsettling phenomena began to plague the Blackwood residents, transforming their once familiar sanctuary into a locus of the strange and the sinister. Doors, seemingly of their own volition, would slam shut with a resounding bang, the force of the impact vibrating through the floorboards and sending tremors of unease through the occupants. These were not the gentle sighs of an old house settling on its foundations, nor the playful gusts of wind finding their way through unseen cracks. These were forceful, deliberate closures, abrupt and startling, that echoed through the silent house like ghostly pronouncements, each one a jarring jolt to their already frayed nerves, whispering of an unseen presence and a growing malevolence. Food left out on the heavy oak table in the dining room, once a symbol of family gatherings and shared meals, would spoil at an alarming rate, turning rancid within hours, even in the cool of the evening when a gentle breeze drifted through the open windows. Fresh milk, still in its earthenware pitcher, soured with unnatural speed, its creamy texture curdling into a lumpy, sour mass. Loaves of bread, baked that very morning with the comforting aroma of home, grew fuzzy with blue and green mold in what seemed like mere moments. Cooked meat, its savory scent replaced by a nauseatingly sweet and putrid odor, emitted a foul miasma that clung to the air, as if some unseen force was not merely accelerating the natural processes of decay but actively corrupting the very essence of life within the confines of their home, a subtle yet pervasive sign of a world tilting precariously on its axis. Beyond the confines of the Blackwood house, a more disturbing trend began to emerge, casting a heavy pall of dread over the entire village of Oakhaven. The animals, once a comforting presence in their predictable routines, both domestic and wild, started to die in inexplicable and unsettling ways, their lifeless forms becoming grim punctuation marks in the unfolding horror. Chickens in their coops, their morning clucking abruptly silenced, would be found lying still and cold amongst their startled flock, their bodies unmarked by any visible injury, their eyes staring blankly at the familiar sky as if they had witnessed some unspeakable terror in their final moments. Ducks in the village pond, usually paddling serenely across the water's surface, would suddenly float belly up, their webbed feet frozen in unnatural positions, seemingly struck down by an unseen ailment, a silent testament to a creeping pestilence that defied any natural explanation. Even the stray dogs that roamed the village, usually hardy and resilient scavengers, their barks a familiar sound in the quiet lanes, were discovered dead in the shadowy alleys and along the dusty roadside, their bodies stiff and cold, their once bright eyes now dull and vacant. A particularly beloved old hound belonging to Mrs. Gable, a fixture in the village known for its gentle nature and wagging tail, was found lying peacefully in its kennel beneath the sprawling oak tree in her yard, its head resting on its paws as if asleep, but its spirit had inexplicably departed, leaving behind an unsettling stillness. The air in the village, once carrying the comforting sense of wood smoke and blooming jasmine, began to carry a faint, unsettling odor, a subtle yet persistent hint of mortality, of decay, and the grave, that clung to the dampness of the morning mist and the stillness of the afternoon heat, a constant, invisible reminder that something was profoundly wrong in Oakhaven. Amidst this growing unease, a palpable sense of dread that hung heavy in the air like an approaching storm, Tam remained confined to his room, a consequence of his drunken and disrespectful outburst during his father's wake, a display of unfilial behavior that had shocked even those accustomed to his frequent indiscretions. The room, ironically and perhaps cruelly, was the very one where Silas had breathed his last, the site of their collective grief, and now it served as a makeshift prison for his unruly son, a stark symbol of the fractured state of their family. Eleanor and Van, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion, had barred the heavy wooden door from the outside, the rusty bolt scraping against the frame with a finality that echoed their resolve. Their immediate concern for Tam's disruptive behavior, his potential to further desecrate their morning with his drunken antics, had momentarily outweighed any deeper consideration of the strange and unsettling occurrences that were beginning to grip their home and their village, a testament to the human tendency to focus on the immediate and tangible even as the inexplicable looms. They checked on him periodically, their footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards as they approached his door, leaving a meager offering of food and a clay pitcher of water outside, a silent acknowledgement of their familial duty even in the face of his transgression. But Tam remained silent and unseen within his self-imposed isolation, a dark and brooding presence in the heart of their troubled home, seemingly oblivious to the spectral drama that was slowly and inexorably gripping their home and their village in its cold embrace. As the long days crawled by, each sunrise bringing with it a fresh wave of anxiety and each sunset deepening the encroaching shadows, a sense of helplessness began to weigh heavily on Eleanor and Van, a suffocating burden that threatened to crush their spirits. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that something was terribly wrong, that the return of Silas was not the miraculous answer to their prayers but a terrifying anomaly, a disruption of the natural order with unforeseen and potentially catastrophic consequences. Driven by a desperate hope for answers, a fragile ember of possibility flickering in the growing darkness, they decided to perform a traditional ancestral veneration ceremony, a time-honored ritual intended to honor their forebears and seek their guidance, hoping to glean some insight into the unfolding strangeness or perhaps appease whatever unseen forces had been stirred by Silas's unnatural return. The small, intricately carved altar in the main room, usually adorned with fresh flowers and smiling photographs of departed loved ones, was carefully prepared with offerings of ripe fruit, fragrant incense sticks, and small ceramic cups filled with steaming tea, each item placed with meticulous care and silent prayers. As John, her hands trembling slightly, lit the slender incense sticks with a flickering flame, a collective gasp, sharp and sudden, filled the room, the air momentarily thick with held breath. Two of the incense sticks, their tips glowing faintly orange, burned with a short, weak flame, their smoke thin and hesitant, while the third flared tall and strong, its column of smoke rising straight and unwavering towards the heavens, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, grotesque and elongated figures that seemed to writhe in the flickering light, a visual manifestation of their inner turmoil. Old Man Don, his weathered face, a roadmap of wrinkles etched by years of sun and sorrow, now etched with an even deeper worry, stared at the burning incense with a grim expression, his eyes narrowed in ancient contemplation. "Too short, one long," he murmured, his voice low and heavy with foreboding, a pronouncement that seemed to carry the weight of generations. "It is a sign of great misfortune." He recounted tales from their family history, whispered stories passed down through the years, instances when such an ominous omen had appeared during ancestral rites, each one preceding a period of profound sorrow and significant loss, a chilling testament to the interconnectedness of the living and the dead and the subtle language of the spiritual realm. He spoke of a sudden, inexplicable illness that had swept through their family decades ago, claiming the life of a vibrant young cousin just on the cusp of adulthood. He recalled a disastrous harvest, when blight had inexplicably withered their crops, leaving the family teetering on the brink of poverty and starvation. And he recounted the bitter feud that had divided their kin for years, a schism that had begun with a seemingly minor disagreement but had festered and grown, leaving scars that time had struggled to heal, all prefaced by the unsettling image of two short incense sticks flanking a tall one. The sight of the uneven flames, a stark visual representation of imbalance and disharmony, stirred deep-seated anxieties within the gathered family, dredging up half-forgotten memories of past tragedies and amplifying their present fear, painting the unfolding events with a dark and ominous brush. Driven by this ominous sign, a chilling confirmation of their growing unease, Vin and Chan resolved to seek the help of a respected spiritual medium, someone deeply attuned to the unseen world, someone who could interpret the strange and terrifying events plaguing their village and perhaps offer a way to restore the delicate balance that had been so violently disrupted. They traveled to neighboring villages, their old motorbikes sputtering along dusty tracks and winding paths, inquiring about wise elders, powerful shamans, or anyone rumored to possess the knowledge to navigate the treacherous currents of the supernatural. But their initial efforts proved dishearteningly fruitless. The few they managed to locate were either too frail with age and infirmity to undertake the journey back to Oakhaven, their wisdom locked within their failing bodies, or they listened to the Blackwoods' desperate pleas with wide, fearful eyes, claiming to have no experience with such dark and potent phenomena, their own spiritual defenses seemingly inadequate against the encroaching evil. Each failed attempt, each polite refusal or fearful dismissal, chipped away at their already dwindling hope, leaving them feeling increasingly isolated and vulnerable to the encroaching darkness, adrift in a sea of the inexplicable with no lighthouse in sight. The whispers in the village of Oakhaven grew louder and more frantic, tales of the Blackwood house being cursed, of Silas's return being not a miracle but an unholy act that had angered the spirits, tales that spread like wildfire through the close-knit community, fueled by fear and speculation. Fear was a contagion, spreading rapidly through the once familiar lanes and homes, turning neighbor against neighbor with suspicion and dread. The already tense and suffocating atmosphere within the Blackwood house, a place now haunted by the silent presence of the returned Silas and the unsettling occurrences that followed him, reached a horrifying crescendo, a peak of terror that would forever be etched into the memories of those who witnessed it. Chan, her heart heavy with a growing unease about her brother's prolonged silence, a silence that felt less like sullenness and more like an ominous void, finally persuaded Vin, his own anxieties about the strange happenings reaching a breaking point, to force open Tam's locked door. The heavy wooden panel groaned in protest as Vin's shoulder slammed against it, the rusty hinges screaming in agony before finally giving way. The scene that greeted them on the other side was one that would forever be etched into their nightmares, a tableau of horror that defied comprehension. Tam lay sprawled on the floor of his room, his limbs at unnatural angles, his body unnaturally still, a grotesque parody of sleep. A wave of nausea, thick and suffocating, washed over them as they cautiously approached, the air in the room heavy with the unmistakable, cloying stench of decay, a smell that spoke of irreversible biological processes unfolding in the absence of life. His skin, once bearing the ruddy hue of a drinker, was now a sickly gray, bloated and discolored, stretched taut over his swollen features. His eyes, usually bloodshot and darting, stared blankly at the ceiling, wide open yet utterly vacant, reflecting nothing but the dim light filtering through the dusty window, empty vessels that held no trace of his former spark. But the true, gut-wrenching horror lay in the horrifying detail of his final resting place. Tam's decomposing body was not on the narrow bed where he had been confined. It was half-submerged within the dark, looming presence of Silas's coffin, the very object that the reanimated patriarch so desperately craved, the silent, ominous centerpiece of the unfolding nightmare. The heavy oak lid lay slightly ajar, a dark, inviting maw, as if Tam, in his final moments of confusion or despair, had crawled inside seeking a perverse refuge, only to meet a gruesome and inexplicable end within the very vessel meant for his father's eternal rest. The sight was so profoundly disturbing, so utterly inexplicable and violating, that both Chan and Vin recoiled in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process the impossible reality before them, the horrifying truth of the malevolent force in their midst becoming terrifyingly clear, a cold, undeniable certainty that settled deep within their bones. The ghastly discovery of Tam's decomposing body nestled within his father's coffin sent a fresh and far more potent wave of terror rippling through the already village of Oakhaven. The unnatural death, occurring within the very confines of the resurrected Silas's funereal vessel, fueled the growing fear that something truly ancient and evil had taken root in their village, a parasitic entity feeding on their peace and their lives. The hushed whispers that had characterized the initial unease now turned to open cries of alarm, raw expressions of terror and disbelief that echoed through the narrow lanes. A palpable sense of dread, thick and suffocating, hung in the air, clinging to the villagers like a shroud, a constant reminder of the unseen menace that lurked among them. Before the already traumatized villagers could fully process this latest, most intimate horror, a new series of gruesome and inexplicable events erupted, plunging Oakhaven into utter pandemonium, shattering any remaining semblance of order and plunging them into the abyss of primal fear. Old Man Bay, a respected elder of the community, his face a comforting map of wrinkles earned through years of honest labor and quiet wisdom, a man known throughout Oakhaven for his kindness, his gentle demeanor, and the sweet apples from his sprawling orchard, was found dead amidst his blossoming trees. His body was contorted in an unnatural and grotesque way, his limbs twisted at impossible angles, his face frozen in a mask of unimaginable terror, his wide eyes staring sightlessly at the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. His throat bore strange, dark markings, almost like deep bruises arranged in an unfamiliar pattern, markings that no one in the village, not even the oldest and most knowledgeable, could identify, adding another layer of chilling mystery to his demise. The peaceful image of his fruit trees, heavy with the promise of ripening produce, a symbol of nature's bounty and the comforting cycle of life, was now grotesquely juxtaposed with the stark and brutal horror of his death, a violation of the natural order that sent shivers down the spines of all who saw it. Then, as if the village was caught in a rapidly escalating nightmare, came the horrifying news of Hung and Viet, two young men, barely out of their teens, who had bravely volunteered for the village night patrol. They were strong and capable lads, their youthful energy and dedication a small beacon of hope in these unsettling times, tasked with the responsibility of ensuring the safety and security of their community during the long, dark hours. They were found in the dense woods bordering the village, a place usually associated with quiet solitude and the rustling of leaves, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition, torn apart with a savage ferocity that defied any human explanation. The scene was so brutal, so viscerally horrifying, that even Constable Thatch, the seasoned local law enforcement officer, a man who had witnessed his share of grim accidents and petty crimes over the years, was visibly shaken, his face pale and his hands trembling as he surveyed the carnage. What was particularly disturbing, what sent a cold wave of dread through the investigators, was the complete and utter lack of any discernible weapon or any sign of a struggle. There were no footprints in the soft earth other than those of the victims themselves, no broken branches or overturned stones to suggest a fight, no discarded blade or blunt instrument. It was as if some unseen, immensely powerful force had simply and effortlessly ripped them apart, their bodies becoming gruesome trophies of an unknown and terrifying predator. The local authorities, a small and under-equipped constabulary accustomed to dealing with minor disputes and occasional petty theft, were utterly baffled by the escalating violence and the bizarre circumstances surrounding each death. Constable Thatch, a man of logic and reason who prided himself on his methodical approach to crime-solving, tried desperately to find a rational explanation for the mounting horrors, but the physical evidence, or rather the distinct lack thereof, defied any conventional understanding of human violence. There were no signs of forced entry at Old Man Bay's secluded orchard, no witnesses who had seen or heard anything unusual. And the fate of the patrolman, discovered deep within the silent woods, offered no clues, only the horrifying reality of their eviscerated bodies. The only recurring anomaly, the single thread connecting these disparate acts of violence, at each and every crime scene, was the inexplicable presence of strange, black fingerprints. These prints were unlike any human fingerprints the police had ever encountered, their inky darkness seeming to absorb the very light around them. They were deep black, almost tar-like in their consistency and appearance, and left a residue that felt strangely cold to the touch. The patterns themselves were also deeply unusual, lacking the familiar and predictable whorls and loops of human dermal ridges, instead exhibiting unsettling, almost geometric designs that seemed alien and unnatural. These eerie and unidentifiable markings left the investigators with a growing sense of unease, a creeping, insidious suspicion that they were dealing with something far beyond the realm of human criminality, something that lurked in the shadows and defied the known laws of nature. The utter inability of the police to provide any logical answers, coupled with the undeniable and mounting evidence of the unnatural, the inexplicable deaths and the bizarre black fingerprints, pushed the already traumatized villagers of Oakhaven to the very brink of despair. The initial shock and fear began to morph into a chilling resignation, a sense of utter helplessness in the face of forces they could not comprehend, let alone combat. The once vibrant and close-knit community, where neighbors had always offered a helping hand and shared in each other's joys and sorrows, was now shrouded in a suffocating atmosphere of terror and suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust, their friendly greetings replaced by wary glances and hushed whispers behind closed doors. The comforting routines of daily life, the familiar rhythms of work and rest, were shattered, replaced by a pervasive and gnawing anxiety that permeated every aspect of their existence. The nights, once a time for peaceful slumber, were now long and filled with fearful whispers and the rustling of unseen things, and the days offered little solace under the heavy, ominous shadow that had fallen upon their once peaceful village, a darkness that seemed to cling to the very air they breathed. The spectral horror that had begun with the unsettling return of Silas was no longer a distant threat, it was a tangible presence, a cold and creeping dread that threatened to consume Oakhaven entirely, body and soul. The inexplicable events, the gruesome and unnatural deaths, and the baffling presence of the black fingerprints had sown. By the way, there are some extensions that require Gemini app activity to work. You can turn this on at Gemini app activity. Waikoko shuava suzuhi enkwa vaifapsu. Following the chilling revelation of Silas's animated form and his unsettling demand for his coffin, a disquiet deeper than the grave settled upon the Blackwood household, a harbinger of the spectral horrors that were about to unfold. The unnatural chill that permeated the parlor seemed to linger, seeping into the very walls and floorboards, a constant reminder of the impossible event they had witnessed. Eleanor, her face etched with a terror that sleep offered no escape from, found herself constantly glancing at the closed door of Silas's room, half expecting, half dreading another impossible appearance. Thomas, usually a man of pragmatic solutions, paced the creaking floorboards late into the night, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and a gnawing unease that defied logic. The children, sensing the shift in the household's atmosphere, clung to their parents, their innocent questions about their grandfather's strange behavior met with strained silence and worried glances. The very air in the old house seemed to vibrate with an unseen tension, a palpable sense of wrongness that settled in the pit of their stomachs and prickled the hairs on the back of their necks. It was more than just grief, it was a primal fear of something unknown, something that had crossed the boundaries of life and death and now resided within their home. And as the inexplicable deaths mounted in the village, each one more gruesome and baffling than the last, and the unsettling presence of the black fingerprints defied any rational explanation offered by the increasingly bewildered local authorities, a desperate question began to form on the lips of the terrified villagers: was there any escape from this encroaching nightmare? Was Oakhaven, a place that had known generations of peace and quietude, now doomed to become a silent testament to an ancient evil reawakened, a haunting echo of a forgotten terror? In the face of such overwhelming dread, a suffocating blanket of fear that threatened to smother the very spirit of Oakhaven, it was the village elder, a man named Man, whose memory stretched back through the mists of time like the gnarled roots of the ancient banyan tree in the village square, and whose wisdom was sought like a soothing balm in times of trouble, who offered a fragile thread of hope. His brow, a landscape of wrinkles etched by the relentless passage of years and now furrowed even deeper by the gravity of the present crisis, held the weight of countless seasons of joy and sorrow witnessed by the village. Man recalled hushed tales, whispered around crackling fires on cold winter nights in his youth, stories passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, tales of a similar malevolent entity, a shapeless dread that had once plagued their ancestors, casting a long, dark shadow upon the land generations ago, bringing with it not only sickness and the chilling touch of inexplicable death but also a creeping madness that had turned neighbor against neighbor and family against family. He remembered the frantic prayers offered under the pale moonlight, the pungent smoke of strange herbs burning in desperate rituals to ward off the unseen evil, and the palpable fear that had gripped the village then, a haunting mirror to the terror that now held Oakhaven in its icy grip, a fear that seeped into their bones and stole their sleep. But within those old stories, etched in his memory with the clarity of a recurring nightmare, like lines on his weathered hands that told the story of a life lived in harmony with the village and its lore, was also the name of their savior, a revered high monk named Hone. Man recounted the legend to the increasingly desperate villagers, gathered in hushed groups in the village square, their faces pale and drawn with fear, and to the bewildered local constabulary, led by the earnest but outmatched Constable Thatch, his voice trembling slightly with the frailty of age but firm with the conviction of a man who had witnessed the cyclical nature of history. He spoke of Hone's serene presence, a beacon of tranquility in a sea of chaos, his eyes that held the ancient wisdom of countless lifetimes, and the potent spiritual energy that radiated from him like a protective aura, a shield against the darkness. The monk, according to the old tales, had arrived as if summoned by the village's collective despair, a solitary figure appearing on the dusty path leading to Oakhaven, a beacon of light cutting through the encroaching darkness. He had faced the malevolent entity in a climactic confrontation that echoed through the annals of their village history, a battle not of steel and fire, not of earthly weapons, but of spiritual fortitude, the unwavering strength of his belief, and sacred incantations, words of power passed down through generations of enlightened souls, ultimately succeeding in banishing the evil, not destroying it, but sealing it away in a place lost to memory, a forgotten prison in the spiritual realm. Mana's tale, though steeped in the lore of the past, a tapestry woven with threads of fear and hope, ignited a fragile spark of hope in the hearts of the terrified villagers, a whisper of a possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, the cyclical nature of their history held a promise of deliverance, that a spiritual solution, a force beyond their earthly comprehension, might exist for their seemingly supernatural plight. For Constable Thatch and his deputies, men steeped in the practicalities of law and order, their world one of tangible evidence and rational deduction, the legend was initially met with a mixture of polite skepticism, a furrowing of brows and doubtful glances, and a dawning realization of their own utter helplessness in the face of such bizarre and terrifying events. Yet, with no earthly leads to follow, no logical explanations for the gruesome deaths, and the bizarre, unsettling evidence of the black fingerprints staring them in the face, a chilling enigma that defied any known forensic science, they found themselves clinging to this ancient story, this sliver of hope offered by the village elder, a desperate grasp at any explanation, no matter how improbable it seemed in the cold light of day. As if the collective hope of Oakhaven, however fragile and desperate, had somehow pierced the veil between worlds, a figure appeared on the outskirts of the village, walking along the dusty path that wound its way through the rice paddies, a young ascetic named Coffin. He was said to be a disciple of the very Moncone whose legend man had so vividly recounted, though many years, like fallen leaves swept away by the wind, had passed since the elder's triumphant confrontation with the ancient evil. Coffin's arrival was not heralded by any grand spectacle or dramatic pronouncement, it was subtle, almost ethereal, like a whisper carried on the wind. He walked barefoot along the dusty village path, his simple robes, woven from coarse cloth, the color of sun-baked earth, blending seamlessly with the landscape, his presence radiating a quiet intensity, an inner stillness that drew the eyes of the few villagers who dared to venture out of their homes, their faces pale and etched with fear. There was an otherworldly quality about him, an aura of detachment from the mundane, a stillness in his dark, piercing gaze that seemed to penetrate beyond the superficial, as if he could see the unseen currents, the malevolent energies that troubled Oakhaven, the invisible tendrils of darkness that snake through their homes and their hearts. A gentle breeze, seemingly originating from nowhere, stirred the dust around his bare feet and rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, even on a day when the air hung heavy and still with an oppressive humidity. The stray animals that had become skittish and aggressive in recent days, their barks and hisses adding to the village's unsettling atmosphere, seemed to quiet in his presence, their fear momentarily abated. Some even approached him with a hesitant curiosity, sniffing at his robes and his staff, a stark contrast to their usual fearful demeanor, as if sensing a kindred spirit, a being who understood the unseen world that now plagued them. He carried little in the way of worldly possessions, a simple, unadorned wooden staff, its surface smooth from years of use, a small cloth-bound book filled with ancient script, its pages yellowed with age and filled with arcane symbols, and a serene expression that hinted at a deep well of inner peace, a tranquility that seemed impervious to the surrounding fear, and a knowledge that transcended the mundane, a wisdom gleaned from years of rigorous training and contemplation. When he spoke to the villagers who cautiously approached him, their voices barely above a whisper, his own voice was calm and resonant, each word carrying a weight of authority that belied his youthful appearance, a quiet confidence that offered a sliver of reassurance in their despair. He inquired about the recent disturbances, listening intently to their fear-choked accounts, his dark eyes unwavering, absorbing their terror, their grief, and their desperate pleas for help, his gaze never flinching from the raw emotion that poured forth. There was a palpable sense that he was not merely a traveler passing through, seeking shelter or sustenance. His arrival felt purposeful, divinely timed, as if the threads of fate, woven through the fabric of their village's history, had drawn into Oakhaven in its darkest hour, a beacon of hope appearing on a storm-tossed sea. Meanwhile, as the shadow of fear lengthened across Oakhaven and the whispers of ancient evils grew louder, echoing in the empty spaces of their once peaceful lives, a pair of unlikely witnesses, two young men more accustomed to the digital world than the supernatural, stumbled upon irrefutable evidence of the malevolent force at play. Lon, a somewhat aimless but ultimately well-meaning young man, a distant nephew of the deceased Silas whose days were usually spent in idle pursuits and whose understanding of village lore was limited at best, and his ever-present friend Lam, a tech-savvy individual whose smartphone was an extension of his own being, a chronicler of their mundane existence with a peculiar penchant for documenting everything, from their late-night noodle runs to the village gossip, had been driven by a morbid Curiosity, a youthful fascination with the macabre, to investigate the increasingly infamous Blackwood house. They had heard the unsettling rumors that now swirled through the village like a malevolent wind, the hushed accounts of strange occurrences within the darkened walls of the old house, whispers of unnatural chills and slamming doors, and armed with Lamb's state-of-the-art smartphone, its camera lens their unwitting weapon, they had intended to capture some proof of the haunting, perhaps to dispel what they initially believed to be the growing hysteria of superstitious villagers, or maybe, secretly, to gain some fleeting notoriety on social media, a digital badge of courage in the face of local legend. They had approached the house with a mixture of trepidation and excitement, the air around it feeling strangely heavy and still, a palpable silence that seemed to absorb all sound. Peeking through a grimy window, their breath held tight in their chests, they had witnessed a scene that would forever be etched into their nightmares, a tableau of raw, visceral horror that defied any rational explanation. Silas, or rather, the animated husk that now bore his likeness, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings, his eyes glowing with an eerie, malevolent light that seemed to pierce the gloom, was in the midst of devouring a live chicken, its frantic squawks abruptly silenced, feathers flying in a chaotic whirlwind, and blood, a shocking crimson against his pallid, corpse-like face, staining his lips and chin. The raw, visceral horror of the act, the sheer unnaturalness of it, the primal savagery displayed by what was once a familiar and kindly old man, was far beyond anything their youthful imaginations could have conjured. Lamb, his hand trembling violently, his initial thrill replaced by a gut-wrenching terror, had instinctively raised his phone, the digital eye recording the gruesome spectacle in shaky but undeniably clear detail. The footage, when they later reviewed it in the pale light of dawn, was sickeningly real, a stark and brutal depiction of a creature utterly transformed, a being far removed from the gentle patriarch they had once known, a horrifying perversion of life and death. It was a piece of evidence that transcended mere hearsay and frightened whispers, a digital testament to the terrifying reality that had taken hold of Silas, a visual confirmation of the evil that now stalked their village. Armed with this shocking footage, a digital Pandora's box unleashing the true horror upon their understanding, Long and Lamb, their youthful bravado completely evaporated, replaced by a stark, paralyzing terror, sought out the authorities, their initial desire for internet fame now a distant and shameful memory. Constable Thatch, a man who prided himself on his level-headedness and his adherence to logic, initially dismissive of their wild and frantic claims, his skepticism evident in his weary sigh and the condescending tone of his questions, was visibly shaken, his face paling and his eyes widening in disbelief as he viewed the video on Lamb's phone. The raw, undeniable evidence of Silas's monstrous act, the sheer brutality of it captured in irrefutable digital clarity, coupled with the mounting inexplicable deaths in the village and the mysterious, unsettling presence of the black fingerprints that defied any known forensic analysis, finally shattered his reliance on conventional explanations, the foundations of his rational world crumbling before his very eyes. It was a turning point, a stark and terrifying moment when the possibility of a supernatural involvement, a concept he had always scoffed at, could no longer be ignored, a chilling realization that they were dealing with something far beyond the scope of human crime. Just as the constable, his mind reeling from the implications of the video, was grappling with this horrifying revelation, trying to reconcile the impossible with the tangible, Tu Fong arrived at the village center, his presence radiating an aura of calm and quiet authority amidst the swirling fear and growing hysteria of the gathered villagers. Drawn by the commotion surrounding the visibly disturbed constable and the two ashen-faced young men clutching Lamb's phone like a talisman of their terror, Tu Fong watched the gruesome video, his expression remaining serene, his brow furrowed not in shock but in a deep, knowing contemplation, his dark eyes narrowing slightly with an ancient intensity. When Constable Thatch, his voice hoarse with disbelief and a dawning fear, asked for his opinion, his voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the anxious murmurs of the crowd. "There is a dark entity at work here," he stated, his gaze piercing, seeming to look beyond the surface of their fear and into the heart of the encroaching evil. "The elder Silas has been possessed. What you have witnessed is not the act of a living man, but the manifestation of a malevolent spirit that has taken root within his reanimated form." His words, spoken with such unwavering conviction and an air of undeniable authority, resonated deeply with the villagers who had gathered, their faces a mixture of terror and a grim sense of confirmation, validating their deepest, most irrational fears and lending an undeniable credence to man's ancient legend, transforming it from a mere folktale into a potential explanation for the horrors unfolding before them. The confirmation of demonic possession, spoken not by a frightened villager but by one who seemed to possess an intrinsic understanding of such dark and powerful forces, sent a fresh wave of icy fear through Oakhaven, a chilling certainty that the evil they faced was not of this world, but it also solidified the fragile hope that had been kindled by Mana's story. If Silas was indeed possessed, a vessel for an ancient evil, then perhaps, like the evil of the past, this entity too could be confronted, its power challenged, and ultimately banished back to the shadows from whence it came. The stage was now set for a confrontation, a terrifying battle between the mortal and the otherworldly, between the desperate hope of the villagers and the malevolent power that had gripped their village, with the fate of Oakhaven hanging precariously in the balance, a fragile leaf caught in a spectral storm. The villagers, their fear now mingled with a desperate, almost feverish hope, looked to the young Fapsu, Coffin, this quiet stranger who had arrived as if an answer to their prayers, their unlikely savior, wondering what ancient rituals he would invoke, what sacred incantations he would chant, how the seemingly unassuming young man could possibly stand against a force that had reanimated the dead and brought such unspeakable terror to their once peaceful village. The whispers of ancient lore had become a tangible, terrifying reality, and the battle for the soul of Oakhaven was about to begin, the first step hinging on Coffin's next move, his plan to confront the spectral horror that had taken root in their midst and threatened to consume them all. Tran Xian Sin Tu Trong Rong Sao. The fragile hope ignited by Coffin's arrival, a solitary flame flickering against the encroaching darkness, demanded action. No longer could they merely wait in fear, huddled in their homes as the unnatural events unfolded like the pages of some terrifying folklore. The confirmation of demonic possession, starkly revealed by Lam's shaky video footage and Coffin's somber pronouncements, the chilling reality of Silas's grotesque transformation into a ravenous mockery of his former self, necessitated a direct and perilous confrontation. And so, guided by a grim determination that gnawed at their fear in Coffin's quiet but firm instructions, a small, uneasy group ventured into the dense woods bordering Oakhaven. The air here was a stark contrast to the stifling, fear-laden atmosphere of the village, thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and the decaying fragrance of fallen leaves, a natural cycle of life and death now grotesquely inverted by the unnatural chill that had gripped the village like an icy hand. Leading the way, his presence a beacon of focused calm in their collective anxiety, was Coffin. His simple wooden staff, no ornate carvings or gleaming metal adorned it, was held firmly in his grasp, appearing less a weapon and more a natural extension of his being, a conduit of unseen energies. His bare feet moved silently over the uneven terrain, navigating the tangled roots and fallen branches with an almost ethereal grace, a stark contrast to the heavy, uncertain steps of his companions. Behind him walked Long and Lam, their initial terror, the kind that chills you to the bone and makes your breath catch in your throat, now tempered by a nervous resolve, a grim sense of necessity. The visceral memory of the gruesome video, the horrifying image of their once familiar neighbor indulging in a bestial feast, fueled their reluctant bravery, a morbid curiosity now intertwined with a desperate hope for salvation. And then there was Silas, or what remained of him, a horrifying spectacle of animated decay. His eyes, once kind and crinkled with age, now burned with a malevolent red light, like embers glowing in the darkness of a long-dead fire. His movements were jerky and unnatural, each step a grotesque parody of his former gait, as if unseen strings pulled at his limbs, a puppet dancing to the sinister tune of the ancient evil that possessed him. He emitted a low, guttural growl, a sound that clawed at their sanity, a perversion of the familiar, comforting voice they once knew, now twisted into something alien and threatening. Their destination, a place whispered about in hushed tones by the village elders, was a secluded clearing nestled near an ancient banyan tree. Its gnarled branches, thick as a man's torso and covered in clinging vines, reached towards the sky like skeletal arms, their leaves rustling with an ancient wisdom, a place that felt both timeless and strangely ominous, a natural arena, steeped in the history of the land, for the supernatural battle that was about to unfold. As they entered the clearing, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. The air, previously still and heavy, now crackled with an unseen energy, a tangible tension that prickled their skin. The very leaves on the surrounding trees seemed to tremble, not from a natural breeze, but from a subtle vibration in the air itself. A sudden gust of wind, seemingly originating from nowhere, whipped through the ancient branches of the banyan, carrying with it a faint, unsettling whisper, like the sigh of a long-forgotten spirit. Silas lunged forward with surprising, unnatural speed, his decaying hands, the fingernails long and black, outstretched like talons, his unnatural strength amplified by the demonic entity that resided within him, granting him a horrifying vitality. Long and Lam recoiled in horror, their breath catching in their throats, the image of him devouring the chicken, the raw, bloody spectacle, flashing vividly in their minds, a nightmare made real. "Stay behind me!" Tu Fong commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor amidst the rising tide of their fear, stepping forward to meet the possessed Silas. He raised his simple wooden staff, and as he did, the air around it seemed to shimmer and distort, as if heat radiated from its surface. It wasn't just an ordinary piece of wood, cut from a common tree. It felt imbued with a quiet power, a reservoir of focused spiritual energy, a conduit for the ancient forces that flowed through Tu Fong, a tangible link to the unseen world. The battle began not with a physical clash, a brutal exchange of blows, but with a silent war of wills, a contest between the earthly and the otherworldly. Tu Fong stood his ground, his bare feet planted firmly on the earth, drawing strength from the very ground beneath him. He chanted in a low, resonant voice, the ancient words of power echoing through the clearing, each syllable seeming to vibrate with an unseen energy, a counter-frequency to the malevolent aura emanating from Silas. A visible energy, a soft, golden light, began to emanate from Tu Fong, pushing back against the oppressive darkness that radiated from Silas like a suffocating shroud. The possessed man roared, a sound that was both recognizably human, a distorted echo of Silas's voice, and something terrifyingly other, a guttural bellow that seemed to claw at their sanity, a sound from the depths of nightmare. He swiped at Tu Fong with unnatural ferocity, his movements a grotesque ballet of decay and demonic strength. Tu Fong moved with an almost preternatural speed and grace, dodging the attack with a fluid motion that belied the intensity of the moment, and struck the ground with the butt of his staff. The earth beneath them trembled violently, and a ripple of raw energy spread outwards, momentarily staggering Silas, disrupting the demonic hold, causing the red light in his eyes to flicker. Suddenly, an unnatural chill permeated the clearing, a cold that seeped into their bones despite the humid air. A spectral figure flickered into existence behind Tu Fong, its form translucent and shimmering like heat haze, but undeniably the serene visage of the High Monk Hon, his features etched with wisdom and compassion. It was a fleeting presence, a whisper of a soul long passed into the spiritual realm, its eyes, though ethereal, filled with a gentle but powerful resolve, a silent affirmation of Tu Fong's path. Though it made no sound that their mortal ears could perceive, its presence was palpable, a sudden surge of pure spiritual energy that seemed to flow into Tu Fong, bolstering his strength, reinforcing his resolve against the encroaching darkness. The demonic entity within Silas, a sentient malevolence that had lain dormant for centuries, now fully awakened and enraged by Tu Fong's defiance and the spectral intervention, turned its burning red eyes towards Long and Lam, its malevolent intent as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. It moved with terrifying speed, a blur of decaying flesh and unnatural strength, its focus shifting to the vulnerable onlookers. Long cried out in pure, unadulterated fear, stumbling backwards over a gnarled root, his eyes wide with terror as the possessed Silas lunged towards him. Lam, despite his own paralyzing terror, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, fumbled desperately in his pocket, his fingers closing around the small, intricately carved wooden amulet that his grandmother, a woman steeped in local traditions and beliefs, had insisted he wear for protection against ill fortune and unseen evils. As the possessed Silas reached for Long, its decaying fingers outstretched, a faint but distinct golden light pulsed from Lam's amulet, striking the demonic entity like an invisible force field, a tangible wave of protective energy. The creature recoiled with a screech of pure agony, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the clearing, black smoke momentarily billowing from its decaying flesh, a sign of the demonic power being repelled. Long gasped, feeling a strange warmth emanating from Lam's amulet, a comforting heat spreading through his chest, a tangible barrier, however small, against the supernatural assault. Seizing this crucial opportunity, with the demonic entity momentarily weakened and distracted, Tu Fong focused his energy, drawing upon the wellspring of spiritual power within him, honed through years of rigorous training and meditation. He held his simple staff aloft, and the golden light surrounding it intensified dramatically, no longer a mere aura but a radiant beacon, forming intricate patterns in the air, ancient symbols of protection, warding, and banishment, their luminous forms swirling around the staff like celestial calligraphy. He chanted louder, his voice resonating with an almost otherworldly power, the ancient syllables echoing through the forest, each word a hammer blow against the encroaching darkness, and with a final, resolute cry, he thrust the staff forward. A beam of pure, concentrated energy, a lance of golden light, erupted from the tip, striking the possessed Silas directly in the chest, impacting with the force of a physical blow, yet carrying a spiritual weight that transcended the material. The creature shrieked, a sound that tore through the stillness of the forest, a cacophony of pain and fury, a primal scream of a trapped and tormented entity. The black energy that had clung to Silas like a second skin flickered and writhed violently, struggling desperately against the purifying, searing light that threatened to consume it. The battle reached its terrifying climax as Tu Fong channeled the entirety of his spiritual energy, his very life force intertwined with the ancient power he wielded, into one final, earth-shattering incantation. The spectral image of Hone flickered into existence once more, its translucent gaze fixed intently on the writhing form of the possessed Silas, a silent benediction, a final surge of spiritual aid, before fading completely back into the ethereal realm. The golden light emanating from Tu Fong's staff intensified to an unbearable brightness, bathing the clearing in an almost blinding radiance, and as it struck the demonic entity once more, it didn't merely push it back or weaken it, it seemed to unravel its very essence, to tear it apart from the inside out, dissolving the unholy bond that held it to the mortal realm. The black energy surrounding Silas convulsed violently, like a dying serpent, and then, with a final, agonizing scream that seemed to echo through the ages, it was drawn inexorably into the light, absorbed completely by Tu Fong's staff, leaving behind only a lingering scent of ozone and a profound sense of emptiness. As the demonic entity was finally vanquished, its malevolent presence eradicated from the physical realm, the unnatural energy that had animated Silas's corpse, the dark force that had defied the natural order, abruptly dissipated. His body, no longer held together by the insidious power, began to rapidly decay, the unnatural vitality draining away, turning to dust and withered flesh before their very eyes, a gruesome and unsettling testament to the unnatural power that had briefly held it together, a stark reminder of the violation of life and death they had just witnessed. The stench of decay, sharp and sickening, filled the air, a palpable reminder of the horror they had just confronted and overcome. Long, his limbs still trembling uncontrollably, his face pale and slick with sweat, rushed to Lam's side, his friend lying motionless on the forest floor. The sheer force of the demonic attack, the raw malevolence directed at him, had knocked Lam unconscious. He lay pale and still, his breathing shallow and uneven. Long frantically shook him, his voice choked with fear and concern, calling his name repeatedly, a desperate plea for a sign of life. After a tense, agonizing moment that stretched into an eternity, Lam's eyelids fluttered open. He groaned softly, his eyes unfocused and glazed, but slowly, as the initial shock wore off, recognition dawned in their depths. He looked at Long, his gaze still clouded with confusion, then his eyes fell upon the rapidly decaying remains of Silas, and a wave of nausea washed over him, his stomach churning at the horrifying sight. The silence that followed the brutal battle was heavy and profound, broken only by their ragged breaths, the sound of their hearts pounding in their chests, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the soft breeze that had returned, as if nature itself was sighing in relief. The oppressive, unnatural atmosphere that had clung to the clearing had lifted, replaced by a sense of profound exhaustion that seeped into their very bones, but also a fragile, tentative sense of relief, the immediate, terrifying threat seemingly neutralized. The forest, moments ago a battleground of the supernatural, seemed to breathe again, the ancient banyan tree standing sentinel over the clearing, its ancient branches swaying gently, a silent witness to the life and death struggle that had just concluded. But even as they began to process the unbelievable events they had just experienced, a new, unsettling question lingered in the air, a persistent shadow of uncertainty that clung to the edges of their relief. What exactly had Tu Fong done? Had he truly destroyed the ancient evil, severing its connection to their world, or had he merely contained it once more, pushing it back into the shadows from whence it came, a temporary reprieve? And what would be the lasting consequences of this terrifying encounter, this brush with the supernatural, for Oakhaven and its people, their understanding of reality forever altered? The answers, they knew with a chilling certainty, lay in the unfolding events, in the days and weeks to come, as they grappled with the aftermath of the spectral battle fought in the deep woods, a battle that had irrevocably changed their lives and the fate of their village. How qua va su trovi? The profound stillness that had settled over the forest after the violent expulsion of the demonic entity held a deceptive tranquility. It was the silence after a scream, the eerie quiet that descends when a storm has passed, leaving behind a landscape subtly altered, bearing the invisible marks of the conflict. Long's consciousness flickered back like a faulty lamp, the edges of his vision blurry, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. The last thing he clearly remembered was the horrifying red glow in Silas's eyes, the unnatural speed of his attack, and then, nothing. A gentle pressure on his temple, a warmth that seeped into his skull, was his first sensation of returning to the waking world. Tu Fong knelt beside him, his face etched with a weariness that belied his inner strength. The faint golden light that emanated from his fingertips as he focused his energy was a subtle beacon in the dimming forest, a tangible manifestation of the spiritual power he commanded. The low hum that resonated from him was a soothing balm, a vibration that seemed to untangle the knots of fear and shock that had tightened within Lon's body. As awareness fully returned, a groan escaped Lon's lips, a protest against the pain that now throbbed in his side, a dull, persistent ache that served as a brutal reminder of the supernatural blow he had endured. His eyes fluttered open, confusion warring with the lingering tendrils of terror. The image of Silas's monstrous visage flashed behind his eyelids, making him flinch. Lam's return to consciousness was a more gradual ascent. He stirred restlessly, his body stiff and sore from where he had fallen, a low whimper escaping his throat. The world swam into focus slowly, the familiar shapes of trees and undergrowth seeming alien and threatening in the aftermath of their terrifying encounter. His gaze locked onto Tu Fong's calm presence, a steadfast anchor in the turbulent sea of his memories. Are we safe? The question was barely audible, a dry, cracked whisper that betrayed the depth of his fear and uncertainty. Tu Fong's slow, steady nod was a small but significant reassurance. For now, the immediate danger has passed. But we must leave this place. The reality of their situation pressed down on them, heavy and grim. Silas's physical form, the vessel that had been so brutally violated, was now rapidly succumbing to the inevitable processes of decomposition. The unnatural animation provided by the demonic entity had vanished, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth of mortality. The stench of decay, sharp and cloying, hung heavy in the air, a morbid testament to the unnatural forces they had battled. Time was of the essence, they needed to transport Silas's remains, and the injured Lon, back to the village before the body deteriorated beyond recognition, before the horror they had witnessed became even more grotesque. The weight of their ordeal settled heavily upon them, a tangible exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. Tu Fong, for all his spiritual fortitude, wore the marks of the intense battle. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his movements less fluid, a subtle tremor occasionally running through his hands as he assisted Long himself was a shadow of his former self, his face pale and drawn, each movement a painful reminder of his injury. He leaned heavily on Tu Fong, his strength depleted, his spirit shaken. Lam, though physically unharmed, moved with a weary resignation, his eyes haunted by the images he had witnessed, the emotional trauma a palpable weight on his shoulders. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, a steely resolve began to form. They had faced the unimaginable and survived. The need to return to their village, to share their story, to begin the long and difficult process of healing, both individually and as a community, fueled their determination. Long's mind reeled, a chaotic jumble of terror and disbelief. The memory of Silas's transformation, the burning red eyes filled with malevolent intent, the guttural snarls that were a perversion of his familiar voice, played on a loop behind his eyelids. He couldn't shake the feeling of the icy, oppressive energy that had saturated the clearing, a tangible sense of evil that had brushed against his very soul. The fleeting apparition of the High Monk Hone, a serene presence in the midst of the chaos, the unexpected surge of protective energy from Lam's simple amulet, it all felt like a nightmare, a surreal descent into the realm of the unbelievable. Yet, the throbbing pain in his side, the acrid taste in his mouth, the bone-deep exhaustion, these were undeniably real, anchoring him to the horrifying truth of their experience. He glanced at Lam, his friend's face still ashen, his eyes distant and troubled, and a profound sense of gratitude, mixed with a sharp pang of guilt, washed over him. Lam, despite his own terror, had acted selflessly, his grandmother's charm a beacon of hope in their darkest hour, potentially saving him from a fate too gruesome to contemplate. For Lam, the encounter had been a descent into the abyss of fear. The sheer, raw power that had radiated from the possessed Silas, the palpable sense of an ancient, unholy presence, had been overwhelming, threatening to shatter his sanity. The instinctive act of clutching his grandmother's amulet, a habit ingrained since childhood, the sudden, unexpected burst of golden light that had repelled the demonic entity, it felt like a divine intervention, a miracle born of faith and tradition. Yet, the terror lingered, a cold knot in his stomach, the echo of the demonic screech still ringing in his ears, a constant reminder of the thin veil that separated their world from the unimaginable horrors that lurked beyond. Looking at the rapidly decomposing remains of Silas, a man who had been a fixture in their lives, a neighbor, a friend, a wave of profound sadness and revulsion washed over him. The forest, once a place of solace and familiarity, now felt tainted, forever marked by the residue of the supernatural battle, a place where the veil between worlds had been torn asunder. The preparations for their return were somber and physically demanding. Supporting Lom, who could barely stand without assistance, was a constant struggle. His weight shifted precariously, each step a testament to his weakened state and the searing pain that shot through his side. The need to handle Silas's rapidly deteriorating body with a semblance of respect, despite its horrifying transformation, added a layer of grim urgency to their task. The stench of decay grew stronger with each passing moment, a palpable reminder of the fleeting nature of life and the grotesque violation they had witnessed. Working in near silence, their movements slow and deliberate, they fashioned a crude stretcher from sturdy branches, lashed together with thick vines, a makeshift bier for the remains that were quickly turning into a macabre collection of dust and withered flesh. There were no words to adequately convey the gravity of what had transpired, the weight of their experience a tangible presence among them. Finally, their grim preparations complete, they began the slow and arduous journey back towards Oakhaven. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the earlier stillness deepening into an almost oppressive silence. The wind had completely died down, the leaves on the trees hanging heavy and motionless, as if stunned by the violence that had erupted in their midst. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the clearing had dissipated, replaced by a cool, damp air that carried the earthy scent of the forest floor, now tinged with the unmistakable odor of decay. The moon, a sliver of pale light partially obscured by drifting clouds, cast long, distorted shadows that danced around them as they moved, their weary figures illuminated in fleeting glimpses. The nocturnal sounds of the forest, the insistent chirping of crickets, the mournful hoot of a distant owl, seemed amplified in the profound silence, a stark and unsettling contrast to the terrifying cacophony of the battle that had just concluded. It was as if nature itself was recoiling, slowly recovering from the violent intrusion of the supernatural into its ancient domain. The journey was a testament to their exhaustion and their unwavering determination. Long leaned heavily on Tu Fong, his every labored breath a reminder of his injury. Lam, though physically less wounded, moved with a heavy, weary resignation, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, the emotional toll of the encounter etched onto his face. The weight of their shared experience, the haunting image of Silas's corrupted form, the persistent, gnawing fear of the unknown that still clung to them, hung heavy in the air between them, an invisible burden that added to their physical fatigue. Each rustle of leaves in the undergrowth, each unexpected snap of a twig beneath their feet, sent a fresh wave of unease through them, the memory of the demonic presence still raw and vivid, a phantom touch of cold dread. The darkness of the forest, once a familiar and often comforting presence, now felt menacing, filled with unseen eyes and unheard whispers, the ancient trees looming like silent, judgmental sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the gloom. The air felt thick with unspoken thoughts, with the shared trauma that bound them together in their weariness. They were no longer just three individuals returning from an ill-fated walk in the woods, they were survivors, bearing the invisible scars of a battle against an ancient evil, their understanding of the world irrevocably altered by the horrors they had faced. As they finally stumbled out of the dense treeline, the faint, scattered lights of Oakhaven twinkling in the distance felt like a beacon of hope, a promise of safety and the possibility of solace. But even as a wave of relief washed over their weary bodies, a new tide of apprehension followed close behind. How would they explain the inexplicable? How would the villagers react to the horrifying news of Silas's demonic possession and his violent, unnatural demise? The answers to these daunting questions lay just beyond the edge of the forest, in the hushed whispers and fearful glances that undoubtedly awaited their return. The battle in the deep woods might have reached its conclusion, but the consequences, they knew with a chilling certainty, were only just beginning to unfold, casting a long, ominous shadow over the fragile peace of Oakhaven, a shadow that threatened to engulf their familiar world in fear and uncertainty. The spectral confrontation and the unnatural decay were over, but the true aftermath, the reckoning with what they had faced, was yet to come. Duayum va bon toi van kan? The weight of their shared ordeal, a tangible presence that had clung to them throughout their slow and painful journey from the shadowed woods, seemed to lessen ever so slightly as the familiar shapes of Oakhaven's dwellings emerged from the darkness. The faint, scattered lights that pierced the inky blackness were more than just pinpricks, they were beacons, promising a return to the mundane, a fragile hope for the restoration of their shattered normalcy. Yet, as Tu Fong, his arm a steady support for the faltering Long, and the emotionally ravaged Lamb finally set foot on the well-worn dirt path that snaked into the heart of their village, an unsettling stillness hung in the air. It was as if the very soul of Oakhaven held its breath, anticipating the grim tidings they carried. The usual symphony of village life, the comforting cadence of distant dogs barking their territorial claims, the low hum of evening conversations drifting from open windows, the familiar creak of wooden gates swinging in a gentle breeze, was conspicuously absent, replaced by an almost oppressive silence that spoke volumes of an unspoken dread. Their arrival, however, did not occur in a vacuum. The late hour, coupled with an intuitive sense that something was amiss, had drawn a few villagers from their hearts. Perhaps it was the unusual stillness of the night that had stirred their unease, or perhaps it was a premonition, a subtle whisper on the wind carrying a hint of the terror that had unfolded in the forest's depths. Whatever the reason, a small knot of figures emerged from the shadows of their homes, their eyes widening first in surprise at the sight of the returning trio, and then narrowing with a dawning concern as they took in the disheveled state of Long and Lamb. Long's shallow, ragged breaths, the ashen pallor that clung to his face despite the grime of the forest, and the crudely fashioned stretcher bearing a silent, shrouded form painted a stark picture even before a single word was spoken. A collective intake of breath, a shared gasp of horrified understanding, rippled through the small gathering as they recognized their own, and the chilling weight of the silent burden they carried settled heavily upon the quiet village path. Like an invisible wave, the news of their return, and the unspoken tragedy it portended, spread through the darkened lanes of Oakhaven. Hushed whispers carried from house to house, growing in urgency and sorrow with each retelling. Soon, more villagers emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of worry, fear, and a profound sense of loss. The festive paper lanterns that usually cast a warm, inviting glow now seemed to flicker with a mournful light, their gentle sway in the night air resembling a silent lament. The air itself grew thick with unspoken questions, with a communal dread that hung heavy like a shroud. The joyous relief that would have typically greeted their return from a simple walk in the woods was replaced by a somber, almost reverent silence, a collective acknowledgement of the profound tragedy that had befallen their small, close-knit community. Yet, amidst the palpable grief and the underlying current of fear, a different emotion began to coalesce in the eyes of the villagers as their gazes turned towards Coffin. His quiet strength, the subtle yet undeniable aura of power that still emanated from him despite the evident lines of exhaustion etched on his face, inspired a sense of profound awe and deep gratitude. Whispers of his unusual abilities, tales of his enigmatic arrival with the storm, had circulated through the village like folklore. But witnessing the return of Long and Lamb, bearing the grim testament to a battle fought against unseen, malevolent forces, transformed those whispers into a tangible respect, bordering on reverent fear. He was no longer just the mysterious stranger who had sought shelter from the tempest, he was a protector, a silent guardian who had stood against the darkness that threatened to engulf them all, a beacon of hope in their darkest hour. The immediate aftermath unfolded in a blur of hushed, almost ritualistic activity. Strong, capable arms gently lifted the injured Long from the makeshift stretcher, carrying him with the utmost care towards his home, where his distraught parents, Lon and Ben, awaited with tear-swollen eyes and trembling hands. Their initial relief at seeing their son alive, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness, was swiftly extinguished by the horrifying reality of Silas's fate. The sight of the shrouded remains, the faint but unmistakable odor of decay that clung to it like a morbid perfume, brought forth a fresh torrent of grief, a raw and visceral sorrow mingled with a profound and unsettling unease. The man they had known their entire lives, their neighbor, their friend, the jovial face they had seen countless times, had become something alien, something monstrous, a mere vessel for an ancient evil that their minds struggled to comprehend. For Lon and Ben, the very foundations of their world had been irrevocably shaken. The comforting predictability of their daily routines, the simple joys and familiar sorrows that had defined their lives, had been brutally shattered by the violent intrusion of the supernatural. The loss of Silas, a constant thread in the fabric of their community, left a gaping wound in their hearts, but the manner of his passing, the grotesque corruption he had endured, left a scar that would likely never fully heal. The echoes of joyous laughter that once filled their small home now seemed like a distant, almost dreamlike memory, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence punctuated only by quiet sobs and anxious, whispered consultations. They clung to Long, their only remaining child, with a fierce, almost desperate protectiveness, their hearts forever marked by the unimaginable terror he had faced and survived. The weight of their horrifying experience settled upon Long and Lamb like an invisible but crushing burden, a psychological trauma that would likely linger long after their physical wounds had mended. The vivid, visceral images of Silas's possessed form, the contorted limbs, the burning red eyes filled with malevolent intent, the unnatural snarl that twisted his familiar features, these terrifying memories would become unwelcome specters in the quiet solitude of the night, haunting their dreams with vivid clarity and coloring their waking moments with a persistent, gnawing unease. The once comforting familiarity of the forest, a place of childhood adventures and peaceful reflection, would forever be tainted, transformed into a liminal space where the veil between worlds had thinned, where unimaginable horrors had briefly, terrifyingly, touched their lives. Sleep offered little true respite from the torment of their memories. Lom would often jolt awake in a cold sweat, the phantom pain in his side, where the demonic force had struck him, a sharp and brutal reminder of his brush with the abyss. The grotesque image of Silas's contorted face, frozen in a silent scream of unholy rage, would flash behind his eyelids, and he would hear the chilling echo of the guttural, inhuman growl that had emanated from his friend's corrupted throat. Lamb, too, found his nights plagued by restless dreams. The sudden, blinding surge of golden light erupting from his grandmother's amulet, the sheer, paralyzing terror of facing a being twisted by demonic influence, the sickeningly rapid decay of Silas's physical form, these horrifying images replayed endlessly in the theater of his mind, leaving him shaken, fearful, and questioning the very nature of the reality he had once taken for granted. The world around them, once predictable and safe, now felt fragile, vulnerable to unseen forces that lurked just beyond the periphery of their understanding, waiting for another opportunity to breach the fragile barrier of their known world. The days that followed were shrouded in a heavy atmosphere of mourning and a pervasive sense of unease that permeated every aspect of village life. Silas was laid to rest in the small village cemetery, the funeral a somber and subdued affair attended by the entire community. The usual comforting rituals of grief were tinged with a palpable fear, a silent acknowledgement of the unnatural and terrifying circumstances surrounding his death. The villagers looked at each other with a newfound apprehension in their eyes, a shared, unspoken question hanging in the air: what other darkness might lurk in the shadows? What other unimaginable evils might threaten the fragile peace of their small, isolated existence? Tu Fong remained in Oakhaven for a time, his quiet presence a subtle but significant source of comfort and reassurance to the grieving community. He spoke little of the horrific battle that had transpired in the woods, but his calm demeanor, the steady strength that radiated from him, and the almost tangible air of protection that seemed to surround him helped to soothe the raw edges of their collective fear. He offered quiet words of solace to the devastated Lon and Ben, his deep, understanding gaze offering a silent acknowledgement of their profound and immeasurable loss. To Long and Lamb, he offered a different kind of support, a silent, knowing empathy for the invisible scars they carried, the psychological wounds that ran far deeper than any physical injury. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that some wounds could not be seen, but they were no less real, no less painful, and no less enduring. As the immediate shock of the tragedy began to recede with the passage of days turning into weeks, the duam of their terrifying encounter lingered in Oakhaven like a persistent, unwelcome shadow. The story of Silas's demonic possession and the desperate battle fought in the deep, dark woods transformed into a hushed legend, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones and passed down through the generations. Children, their imaginations ignited by the terrifying details, would huddle closer to their parents on dark, moonless nights, their wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fascination as they listened to the chilling accounts of the Bong Quiem Lon, the vengeful ghost of the possessed villager, said to still roam the shadowy edges of the forest, a constant, spectral reminder of the unimaginable darkness that had once briefly touched their small community. Long and Lamb carried the weight of their shared trauma in a heavy silence, the horrifying experience forging an unspoken and unbreakable bond between them. They would often find themselves casting nervous glances towards the tree-line of the forest, a subtle flicker of unease in their eyes, a subconscious, persistent fear that the darkness they had faced might one day return, creeping out of the shadows to once again threaten their peace. The world around them had become subtly altered, the comforting predictability of their lives now tinged with a sense of fragility, a heightened awareness of the unseen forces that lay just beyond the veil of their ordinary existence. They had glimpsed the abyss, and in its terrifying way, the abyss had glimpsed back, leaving an indelible mark on their souls. And so, life in Oakhaven slowly, tentatively, returned to its familiar rhythm, but it was a rhythm subtly, irrevocably altered, imbued with a newfound awareness of the unseen world that lay just beyond the periphery of their senses. The memory of Silas, once a comforting and familiar face, now carried a chilling undertone, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the ever-present potential for unimaginable darkness to intrude upon their peaceful world. The whispered stories of the Bong Quiem Lawn would continue to be told, shared around crackling fires on cold winter nights, becoming a permanent and unsettling thread in the rich tapestry of their local folklore, a testament to the night the shadows came alive and the darkness lingered, a silent, chilling promise that some echoes, no matter how faint, never truly fade away. The end of one terrifying story was merely the beginning of another, etched forever in the collective memory of a small village forever touched by the supernatural, a haunting reminder that the darkness might still be lurking, just beyond the edge of the light.